Clara James walked out of the study that winter night holding something that didn't belong to her. Something silver that caught the moonlight, like a blade. Her master had been shouting just minutes before, his voice bouncing off every wall in the mansion, making slaves 3 rooms away flinch at the sound. But now there was only silence, thick and complete, like someone had wrapped the entire world in cotton. By sunrise, Harrison Caldwell couldn't make a single sound, not a whisper, not a groan, nothing at all. The doctors came and went, shaking their heads, unable to explain what had stolen the most powerful voice in Jefferson County. Clara was already gone, vanished into the February darkness with that silver whistle half buried in the snow behind the slave quarters. What happened in that study? What kind of woman steals a man's ability to speak? And how does someone born into chains find the courage to take the one thing that kept those chains locked tight? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Caldwell plantation stretched across 1,200 acres of Kentucky soil, rich earth that yielded tobacco and corn in quantities that made neighboring landowners jealous and resentful in equal measure. Harrison Caldwell had inherited the land from his father in 1853, and in the 7 years since, he had doubled its productivity through methods that made even hardened overseers uncomfortable. He was a man who believed volume equaled authority, that the louder he shouted, the faster slaves would move, the higher profits would climb. His voice had become legendary throughout the county, a booming instrument of control that could be heard from the main house all the way to the tobacco barns, where slaves worked from dawn until their hands bled. Clara James had been born on this plantation 28 years earlier, delivered by her mother in a cabin that leaked rain and let in winter wind through gaps in the wooden walls. Her mother had died when Clara was 9, worked to death in the fields during a summer so hot that 3 other slaves collapsed beside her. Clara had been moved into the main house shortly after, assigned to work in the kitchen where Caldwell's wife, Margaret, supervised the preparation of elaborate meals for guests who came from Louisville and Lexington to discuss politics and business over roasted duck and French wine. The kitchen was its own kind of hell, different from the fields but no less brutal. The heat from the massive stone fireplace made summers unbearable, and the constant demands from Margaret Caldwell, who changed her mind about menus 3 times a day, kept everyone on edge. But Clara had learned early that surviving meant watching, listening, understanding the patterns of the white family's moods and movements. She noticed that Harrison Caldwell's voice got louder when he drank whiskey after dinner, that he shouted at male slaves more than female ones, that his anger peaked in winter when tobacco prices dropped and creditors sent letters demanding payment. She also noticed the silver whistle he kept in his vest pocket, a small instrument he used to summon slaves from distant parts of the property. The whistle had belonged to his father, crafted by a silversmith in Philadelphia, and Harrison treated it with more care than he treated his own children. 3 sharp blasts meant all hands to the main house immediately. 2 long blasts meant the overseer needed to report for instructions. A single sustained note meant punishment was about to be administered, and slaves should gather to witness it as a warning. That whistle was the voice behind the voice, the instrument that organized terror into a system. Winter in Kentucky in 1860 was particularly harsh. Snow began falling in early December and continued through January, with only brief breaks of gray, sunless days. The slave quarters, 20 crude cabins arranged in 2 rows behind the main house offered minimal protection against the cold. Families huddled together at night, sharing threadbare blankets and body heat, trying to preserve enough energy to survive another day of labor. Harrison Caldwell showed no mercy to winter. Fields still needed clearing. Fences still needed mending. Firewood still needed chopping and hauling. His voice cut through the cold air like an axe, pushing exhausted bodies past their limits. Clara had developed a strategy for enduring Harrison's outbursts. When he shouted in the kitchen about undercooked meat or oversalted soup, she made herself small, kept her eyes down, responded with quiet, yes, master acknowledgments that seemed to diffuse his anger faster than arguing or explaining ever could. But something changed in her that winter. Something subtle at first, like a seed splitting open underground before anyone can see the shoot. She began to notice patterns in Harrison's cruelty, mathematical rhythms to his rage. He shouted loudest on Tuesdays after reviewing accounts with his bookkeeper. He reserved his most vicious verbal attacks for Sunday evenings after returning from church, as if the sermons about divine authority gave him fresh energy for earthly domination. The violence escalated in February. A young slave named Daniel, barely 16 years old, had been caught taking an extra portion of cornbread from the kitchen. Harrison ordered him stripped and whipped in the yard between the main house and the quarters, ensuring maximum visibility. Clara was forced to watch from the kitchen window as Daniel's back was opened by leather strips, his screams mixing with Harrison's shouting about theft and discipline and the necessity of harsh punishment to maintain order. The whistle hung from Harrison's neck during the entire ordeal, swinging with each gestured emphasis of his bellowed words. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The image of Daniel's torn flesh kept appearing whenever she closed her eyes. She thought about her mother, about the countless others who had suffered under the Caldwell family's ownership. She thought about that silver whistle and what it represented, how a small metal object had become the linchpin of an entire system of suffering. An idea began forming in her mind, dangerous and impossible. The kind of idea that gets slaves killed for even thinking it. She had noticed something about Harrison Caldwell that others might have missed because they were too busy cowering from his volume. For all his shouting, he rarely spoke quietly. It was as if he had forgotten how to modulate his voice, as if years of yelling had rewired something fundamental in his throat. She had seen him struggle on rare occasions when trying to speak softly to his wife or children, watched him clear his throat repeatedly, noticed the way he reached for whiskey when his voice grew hoarse. There was a weakness there, invisible to most, but evident to someone who had spent years studying him for survival. The Caldwell house held secrets in its architecture. Clara had discovered a loose floorboard in the upstairs hallway that allowed her to hear conversations in Harrison's study below. She had learned about financial troubles the family faced, debts owed to banks in Louisville, investments gone sour in railroad speculation. She knew that Harrison's father had been a shrewd businessman, while Harrison himself was merely loud, mistaking volume for competence. The plantation was slowly failing despite appearances. Hemorrhaging money through bad decisions and extravagant spending meant to impress neighbors who privately mocked the Caldwell's gauche displays of wealth. On the night of February 14th, 1860, a storm rolled across Jefferson County with unusual ferocity. Wind rattled windows and tore shingles from roofs. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to a few feet. Harrison Caldwell had been drinking since dinner, working himself into one of his rages while reviewing account books that showed another month of losses. His shouts could be heard throughout the house, despite the storm's howling. Margaret had retreated to her bedroom with a headache remedy, and the Caldwell children were sleeping fitfully in their rooms on the second floor. Clara had been ordered to bring fresh firewood to the study. She carried an armload of split oak through the kitchen, down the hallway, approaching the study door with the careful steps of someone entering a predator's den. Harrison's voice boomed from inside, cursing the incompetence of his overseer, damning the weather, raging against falling tobacco prices. Clara knocked softly, heard him bellow for her to enter. The study was overheated, fire roaring in the hearth, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Harrison sat behind his massive desk, whiskey bottle at his elbow, account books spread before him like evidence of persecution. His face was flushed red, veins prominent on his forehead and neck. The silver whistle lay on the desk within easy reach, catching firelight like a warning. Clara moved to the fireplace, began arranging logs with practiced efficiency. Harrison continued his tirade, though now it was directed at her. Why had she taken so long? Was she as lazy as all the others? Did she understand how much money her worthlessness cost him? His voice filled the room, bounced off walls, seemed to physically press against her. She said nothing, kept working, played the role she had perfected over 28 years. Then Harrison made a mistake born of whiskey and arrogance. He stood up from his desk, swaying slightly, and moved toward Clara with the clear intention of emphasizing his point through physical intimidation. She was crouched by the fire, hands blackened with soot. He loomed over her, voice reaching a crescendo about respect and obedience, and knowing one's place. His hand reached out, grabbed her shoulder hard enough to bruise. Something in Clara snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of a door closing. She had a fire poker in her hand, iron heated from arranging logs. She didn't swing it at Harrison, didn't strike him, didn't do anything that would be called violent in a legal sense. Instead, she stood up quickly, poker still in hand, and looked directly into his eyes for the first time in her life. The movement was unexpected enough that Harrison stepped back, startled by the sudden equality of their gaze. What happened next occurred so fast that Clara herself would struggle to remember the exact sequence. Harrison's foot caught on the edge of a rug. He stumbled backward, arms windmilling, voice rising in a shout that was part anger, part surprise. His body hit the desk with significant force, and his throat collided with the sharp corner of the open account book ledger, catching him right at the base of his voice box. The impact produced a wet, crunching sound, followed by immediate silence. Harrison's mouth opened, trying to produce sound, but nothing emerged. His hands flew to his throat, eyes wide with shock and pain. Clara stood frozen, fire poker still in hand, watching as the man who had terrorized her entire life struggled to make a single noise. He tried to shout for help, but only managed a faint whistling wheeze, like air escaping from a damaged pipe. The irony of that whistling sound, given the silver instrument on his desk, was not lost on Clara even in that moment of crisis. Harrison collapsed into his chair, still clutching his throat, face darkening from red to purple. Clara knew she should call for help, should alert Margaret or the overseer, but she didn't move. She stood there watching Harrison Caldwell experience helplessness for perhaps the first time in his adult life. watching him understand that all his authority, all his power, had depended on that voice now stolen from him by an accident that wasn't quite an accident. Minutes passed in the hot, silent study. The fire crackled, wind howled outside. Harrison's breathing gradually steadied, but his voice did not return. He stared at Clara with an expression that mixed rage, fear, and something close to understanding. He pointed at the door, clearly ordering her to summon help, but she remained still, holding his gaze with a steadiness that must have terrified him more than any weapon could. Then Clara did something that surprised even herself. She walked to the desk, reached past Harrison's trembling hands, and picked up the silver whistle. The metal was cool against her palm, surprisingly heavy for such a small object. Harrison tried to grab it back, but she stepped away easily, his movements hampered by pain and shock. She examined the whistle carefully, noting the engraved initials of Harrison's father, the worn spots where fingers had gripped it thousands of times, the small dents that marked its history. She brought the whistle to her lips and blew 3 sharp blasts, the signal that meant all slaves to the main house immediately. The sound cut through the storm, clear and commanding. Harrison's eyes widened further, understanding dawning that Clara had just inverted the entire power structure with a single gesture. She blew 2 long blasts next, the signal for the overseer. Then a single sustained note, the sound that meant punishment was coming, though now the meaning had transformed into something Harrison couldn't begin to comprehend. Clara set the whistle back on the desk, not defiantly, but with the careful precision of someone completing a transaction. She picked up the empty firewood basket and walked to the door. Harrison tried to stand, tried to block her path, but his legs betrayed him, and he collapsed back into the chair. Clara paused at the threshold, looked back one final time at the man who had owned her since birth, and spoke the only words that passed between them that night. "You gone, be quiet now," she said, her voice soft but carrying more authority than any of Harrison's shouts ever had. "You gon' understand what it feel like when words won't come, when nobody hear you, when you just noise that don't matter." She closed the study door behind her and walked through the house with measured steps. Slaves were gathering in response to the whistle blasts, confused and frightened, expecting some new horror. The overseer, a brutal man named Pike, was pulling on his coat and heading toward the main house. Clara passed them all without speaking, walked through the kitchen, took her worn shawl from its hook, and stepped out into the storm. The snow was falling so thick that visibility was nearly zero. Perfect conditions for disappearing. Clara moved through the white darkness with purpose, heading not toward the slave quarters, but toward the tree line that marked the northern edge of the Caldwell property. She had thought about this route before during idle moments, imagined what it would take to walk away, where she might go, how she might survive. Kentucky in 1860 was not safe for runaway slaves. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that even in free states, people could be captured and returned. But something had shifted in Clara during those minutes in the study. Fear of capture seemed less important than the necessity of movement, of putting distance between herself and a life that had just transformed in ways no one could predict. She walked for hours through the storm, cold seeping through her thin dress and shawl, snow accumulating on her shoulders and hair. Her feet, wrapped in cloth strips inside worn shoes, grew numb, but she kept moving, driven by an energy that felt almost supernatural. She thought about Harrison Caldwell sitting in his study, voiceless and humiliated, thought about the whistle she had blown, thought about all the slaves who would discover their master's condition and wonder what it meant for their futures. By dawn, Clara had covered perhaps 8 or 9 miles, reaching the edge of a forest she had never seen before. The storm was clearing, revealing a landscape transformed by snow into something unrecognizable. She found shelter in a small cave, really just an overhang of rock, and collapsed into exhausted sleep. When she woke hours later, the sun was high and weak, casting gray light across the snow. Clara's body ached everywhere, and hunger gnawed at her stomach. She had no food, no supplies, only the clothes she wore. But she also felt something unexpected, a sensation so foreign it took her several minutes to identify it. Freedom, not legal freedom, not safety, but the simple freedom of being away from Harrison Caldwell's voice, away from the plantation's routines of suffering, even if this freedom lasted only days before she was caught and returned. Even if punishment awaited her, these moments belonged to her alone. Meanwhile, back at the Caldwell plantation, chaos was unfolding. Margaret Caldwell had discovered Harrison in his study, still unable to speak, communicating only through frantic gestures and scribbled notes. A doctor was summoned from Louisville. Arriving by early afternoon, he examined Harrison's throat, pressed carefully on the bruised tissue, asked questions that Harrison could only answer by nodding or shaking his head. The diagnosis was grim. The trauma to Harrison's larynx had been severe, and while the doctor believed he would survive, there was no guarantee his voice would ever return. Even if it did, it might be permanently damaged. The doctor prescribed rest, warm compresses, and absolute silence. Harrison was to make no attempts to speak for at least 2 weeks, allowing the damaged tissue to heal. This instruction represented its own kind of torture for a man whose entire identity was built on volume and verbal domination. The overseer, Pike, had noticed Clara's absence by mid-morning. When questioned, other slaves claimed not to have seen her since the previous evening. Her cabin was empty, her few possessions still in place, suggesting hasty departure. Pike organized a search party, but the storm had covered all tracks, and the sheer amount of snowfall made following any trail impossible. Dogs were brought out, but they circled uselessly in the yard, unable to pick up a scent through the snow. Margaret Caldwell was torn between concern for her husband and rage at Clara's disappearance. She had always considered Clara one of the better house slaves, reliable and quiet, never causing trouble. The idea that Clara might have been involved in Harrison's injury seemed impossible at first, but as she questioned other slaves and pieced together the timeline, doubt began creeping in. Clara had been the last person to see Harrison before his injury. Clara had disappeared the same night his voice was stolen, and most damning, someone had taken the silver whistle and left it half buried in the snow near the slave quarters, as if abandoning it deliberately. Days passed without any sign of Clara. Posters were printed and distributed throughout Jefferson County and neighboring areas, describing her as a runaway, offering a reward of $200 for her capture and return. The reward was substantial, enough to motivate poor whites and professional slave catchers to actively search. But Kentucky was vast, and a woman traveling alone during winter, if she was clever and lucky, could disappear into the landscape. Clara survived through a combination of caution, desperation, and unexpected kindness. She avoided main roads, traveling only at night, sleeping in barns and abandoned structures during the day. She stole food when necessary, taking only enough to sustain herself, never enough to attract significant attention. 3 times she encountered people who might have reported her, but something in their faces, some flicker of sympathy or understanding, made them turn away instead, choosing not to see what was obviously there. On her 12th day of freedom, Clara reached the Ohio River. The crossing represented more than a geographical boundary. Ohio was a free state, though the Fugitive Slave Act meant it wasn't truly safe. Still, the symbolism mattered. She waited until darkness, found a rowboat tied carelessly to a dock, and pushed off into the current. The river was dangerous, swollen with snowmelt, but Clara had gone too far to stop now. She rowed with strength born of necessity, muscles burning, hands blistering, until the far shore materialized out of the darkness. She pulled the boat onto the bank, abandoned it, and collapsed onto Ohio soil. The act of touching Free State ground felt religious, like a baptism or a rebirth. Clara lay there shaking, whether from cold or emotion she couldn't tell, and thought about Harrison Caldwell sitting in his study, still unable to speak, still processing the humiliation of helplessness. The network of abolitionists and free blacks in southern Ohio was extensive, built through decades of risk and sacrifice. Clara stumbled into this network almost by accident, collapsing from exhaustion outside a barn owned by a Quaker farmer named Isaac Cooper. Isaac's wife, Rachel, found Clara at dawn, recognized immediately what she was seeing, a fugitive at the absolute limit of endurance, and brought her inside without hesitation. The Coopers fed Clara, gave her clean clothes, let her sleep for nearly 20 hours straight in a hidden room built specifically for harboring runaways. When Clara finally woke, Rachel Cooper sat beside her bed with tea and bread and a gentle smile that made Clara weep for reasons she couldn't articulate. "You're safe here," Rachel said, though both women knew safe was always relative for escaped slaves. "But you can't stay long. There are men who search these farms, men who make money returning people like you. We'll get you to the next station by tomorrow night." Clara told Rachel parts of her story, editing carefully, unsure how much honesty was wise even with people who were helping her. She mentioned the plantation, the harsh conditions, the need to escape, but said nothing about Harrison Caldwell's voice or the strange events in the study that night. Some secrets needed to remain private, at least for now. The Underground Railroad moved Clara northward through Ohio over the following weeks, passing her from station to station like a precious, illegal package. She stayed in root cellars and attics and hidden rooms behind false walls. She traveled in wagons covered with hay, in boats on nighttime rivers, once even in a coffin being transported to a cemetery. The conductors who guided her rarely spoke beyond necessary instructions, maintaining operational security through silence. By April of 1860, Clara reached Canada. The journey from Kentucky to freedom had taken nearly 2 months, covered hundreds of miles, and required help from dozens of people who risked everything to assist her. She arrived in a settlement near Windsor, Ontario, where other former slaves had established a small community. The air felt different there, lighter somehow, as if the atmosphere itself was less oppressive once the legal chains of slavery no longer bound her. Clara settled into life in the Canadian settlement slowly, learning skills beyond domestic service, discovering parts of herself that had been dormant under slavery's weight. She worked in a bakery run by a former slave from Virginia. She attended reading classes offered by missionary teachers. She made friends with other women who understood her past without requiring explanations. But she never spoke about the night she left the Caldwell plantation, never mentioned the silver whistle or Harrison Caldwell's lost voice. That story remained locked inside her, a secret shared only with the Kentucky winter wind. Back in Jefferson County, Harrison Caldwell's condition became a source of gossip and speculation throughout the county. His voice had partially returned after 6 weeks, but it was permanently damaged. The booming authority was gone, replaced by a raspy croak that forced him to speak quietly, to choose words carefully, since extended talking caused pain and exhaustion. The silver whistle remained in his desk drawer, but he never used it again. The sound had become too painful, a reminder of everything he had lost. The plantation's productivity declined sharply. Without Harrison's voice to drive the slaves, without his constant shouting to enforce brutal efficiency, work slowed to more human rhythms. Pike, the overseer, tried to compensate through increased physical punishment, but Margaret Caldwell, perhaps changed by watching her husband's humiliation, ordered him to show more restraint. The financial troubles that had been building for years accelerated. By 1861, as the nation slid toward civil war, the Caldwell plantation was in severe debt. Clara heard news from Kentucky occasionally, through letters that circulated among the Canadian settlement, through conversations with newly arrived fugitives who passed through Jefferson County on their journeys north. She learned about Harrison's condition, about the plantation's decline, about the whistle buried in the snow that had become a legend among local slaves. Some versions of the story claimed Clara had poisoned Harrison. Others said she had cursed him using African magic passed down from her mother. A few came closer to the truth, describing an accident in the study, but even these accounts were embellished with supernatural elements that made Clara into something more than human. Clara listened to these stories with mixed feelings. Part of her felt guilty about Harrison's condition. Despite everything he had done, she hadn't intended to injure him, hadn't planned the sequence of events that led to his fall. But another part of her, the part that had endured 28 years of his abuse, felt only cold satisfaction. He had built an empire on volume, on the belief that shouting could substitute for actual authority. Now he understood what it meant to be silenced, to have words trapped inside, to communicate from a position of weakness rather than overwhelming strength. The years passed. The Civil War erupted, raged across the South, transformed the nation's landscape. Kentucky remained in the Union, but was deeply divided, with families split between Confederate and Union loyalties. The Caldwell plantation was eventually sold to pay debts in 1863. Harrison and Margaret moved to a smaller property, taking only a handful of slaves with them. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, those remaining slaves simply walked away. There was no drama, no confrontation. They just left, as Clara had left, choosing movement over stagnation. Harrison Caldwell died in 1868 from pneumonia, his damaged voice finally failing completely in the days before his death. The obituary in the Louisville newspaper mentioned his role as a prominent planter but said nothing about his voice, nothing about the mysterious incident that had stolen it. Nothing about a slave woman named Clara, who had disappeared into a winter storm carrying a silver whistle. Clara learned of Harrison's death through a letter from Rachel Cooper, who had maintained correspondence with her over the years. She felt nothing at the news, no satisfaction, no relief, just a distant acknowledgement that a chapter of history had closed. She had built a new life in Canada by then, married a carpenter named Robert Freeman, was raising 2 children in a small house they owned outright. She worked as a seamstress, attended church on Sundays, participated in community meetings about education and voting rights and the practical challenges of building free black society in a world still hostile to their existence. But sometimes, especially on winter nights when snow fell thick enough to erase the landscape, Clara would think about that night in Harrison Caldwell's study. She would remember the weight of the silver whistle in her palm, the sound it made when she blew those signals, the look in Harrison's eyes when he realized his voice was gone. She would think about power and silence, about who gets to speak and who is forced to listen, about the strange justice of a man who lived through shouting being reduced to whispers. Clara never told anyone the complete story, not even her husband. Some truths were too complicated to share, too tangled with guilt and satisfaction and mystery to articulate clearly. When people asked about her escape from Kentucky, she told the simplified version, the one about fleeing brutal conditions, about the Underground Railroad, about the kindness of strangers who helped her reach freedom. She left out the study, the fall, the damaged voice box, the whistle in the snow. But she kept one object from that night, something she had grabbed without thinking as she left the main house for the last time. A single page from Harrison Caldwell's account book, torn out and folded small, tucked into her dress pocket during those chaotic minutes after the injury. The page showed columns of numbers, debts, and credits, proof of the plantation's financial deterioration. Clara had looked at that page only once since arriving in Canada, then put it away in a small wooden box where she kept precious items. Years later, when Clara was an old woman, white-haired and bent, but still sharp-minded, one of her granddaughters asked about her life under slavery. They were sitting on the porch of Clara's house on a summer evening, watching fireflies drift across the yard. The granddaughter was 14, born free, growing up in a world so different from Clara's youth that explanation seemed almost impossible. Clara considered what to tell her, how much truth to share, how to make the girl understand without traumatizing her. Finally, she told the story, all of it, holding nothing back. She described Harrison Caldwell's voice, the silver whistle, the violence and fear that defined plantation life. She described the study, the fall, the moment when the most powerful voice in Jefferson County vanished into silence. She described walking away through the storm, carrying nothing but her life and a piece of stolen paper. The granddaughter listened with wide eyes, processing this history that was simultaneously distant and intimately connected to her own existence. When Clara finished, the girl asked the question that mattered most. "Did you mean to hurt him?" Clara thought carefully before answering. "I meant to survive," she said finally. What happened to him was his own doing, his own rage and arrogance and whiskey catching up with him. I was just there when it happened, but I chose to walk away. That choice was mine, and it's what mattered most. The granddaughter nodded, seeming to understand that morality in impossible circumstances rarely fits into simple categories of right and wrong. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching darkness settle over the yard, listening to crickets and distant voices of neighbors. Clara died in 1893 at the age of 61, surrounded by children and grandchildren, in a bed she owned in a house that belonged to her. She was buried in a cemetery where former slaves and their descendants rested under stones that bore their names and dates, and sometimes brief descriptions of lives lived in freedom. Clara's stone was simple, just her name and the years of her birth and death, but her family knew the story behind those dates, understood the journey from Kentucky to Canada, from slavery to freedom, from silence to voice. The silver whistle, the one Clara had blown that winter night before leaving it in the snow, was found years later by a child playing in the ruins of the old slave quarters. The buildings had collapsed by then, reclaimed by vegetation, becoming part of the landscape rather than markers of human cruelty. The child brought the whistle home, where her mother recognized it as silver and sold it to a dealer in Louisville for $12. The whistle passed through several collections over the following decades, its history forgotten, reduced to merely an antique curiosity. Eventually, it ended up in a museum, displayed in a case with other artifacts from pre-Civil War Kentucky, labeled simply as Slave Master's Whistle, circa 1850s, origin unknown. Thousands of people walked past it every year without understanding its significance, without knowing about Clara James or Harrison Caldwell, or the night when everything changed. But stories have a way of surviving even when physical evidence is lost or misidentified. Among descendants of the Caldwell plantation slaves, among families who traced their history back to Jefferson County, Kentucky, the tale of Clara and the stolen voice persisted. Details changed with each retelling, embellished or simplified depending on the teller. But the core remained constant. A woman born into slavery had somehow taken the voice of the man who owned her, had walked away into a winter storm, had survived to build a free life, whether through magic or accident, or divine intervention, or simple human courage. Clara James had transformed from property into person, from silence into story. The broader historical significance of Clara's story extends beyond individual biography into questions about power, resistance, and the many forms freedom can take. Historians studying slave resistance often focus on dramatic rebellions, armed uprisings, or organized escape attempts, but most resistance was quieter, more personal, taking forms that didn't make it into newspaper accounts or official records. Women like Clara, who survived through intelligence and observation, who chose their moments carefully, who understood that sometimes the most radical act was simply walking away. These women represented a different kind of heroism that deserves recognition. The American South built its economy and social structure on a foundation that required constant maintenance through violence and intimidation. Men like Harrison Caldwell understood instinctively that their authority was fragile, dependent on performance and repetition. The shouting, the whippings, the whistles and signals and rituals of domination. All of these were necessary because the system itself was inherently unstable. It required constant energy to maintain the fiction that some people were naturally suited to own others, that skin color determined worth, that brutality was somehow ordained by God or nature or history. Clara's story disrupts this narrative, not through dramatic confrontation, but through absence and silence. By leaving, by removing herself from the system, by taking with her the knowledge that Harrison Caldwell's voice could fail, that his authority was always more fragile than it appeared. She struck a blow more lasting than any armed rebellion might have achieved. The slaves who remained on the Caldwell plantation after she left knew what had happened, knew that the master's voice had been stolen by a woman born into chains. That knowledge changed something fundamental in how they understood their own circumstances. The psychological impact of Clara's disappearance rippled through the slave community in ways that are difficult to document but impossible to deny. If Clara James could walk away, could steal the master's authority and survive, then perhaps others could too. The very possibility, regardless of whether individual slaves acted on it, represented a crack in the edifice of control. Harrison Caldwell's lost voice became a symbol, proof that the system's power was not absolute, that moments of vulnerability existed and could be exploited by those courageous or desperate enough to try. In her years of freedom, Clara contributed to this psychological warfare in small but meaningful ways. She wrote letters, though her literacy was limited, to people she had known on the Caldwell plantation, letters that were read aloud in secret gatherings, describing her life in Canada, the work she did, the family she was building. These letters were dangerous to possess, but precious to their recipients. Tangible proof that escape was possible, that life beyond slavery existed and could be claimed by those brave enough to seize it. The Civil War, eventually resolved through violence and political transformation, what individuals like Clara had been attempting through personal courage. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery legally, though the struggle for genuine freedom and equality would continue for generations afterward. But the historical significance of the war should not overshadow the individual stories of resistance that preceded it, the thousands of small rebellions and escapes and refusals that kept the possibility of freedom alive, even in the darkest periods. Clara lived long enough to see the official end of slavery, long enough to vote in Canadian elections and own property and send her children to real schools. She lived long enough to become a grandmother, to tell her story to descendants who would carry it forward into a future she could barely imagine. She died knowing that the journey from that Kentucky plantation to her Canadian home represented not just personal survival but historical significance, a chapter in the larger story of how enslaved people resisted, endured, and ultimately prevailed. The night Clara walked out of Harrison Caldwell's study carrying the silver whistle was not the end of her story but its beginning. Everything that followed, the dangerous journey north, the years of building a free life, the family she raised, the community she helped create, all of it grew from that single moment when she looked into the eyes of the man who owned her and chose to leave. The act of walking away, simple and profound, transformed her from Clara James the slave into Clara Freeman, the woman, from property into person, from silence into voice. The whistle itself, that small silver instrument that had organized so much suffering, ended up in a museum case where it can no longer summon anyone, can no longer enforce authority, can only exist as evidence of a history we must remember to prevent repeating. But the real power of Clara's story lies not in objects or physical evidence, but in the narrative itself, in the telling and retelling across generations, in the way her courage inspires others, facing their own struggles against systems designed to silence and control them. In the end, Clara James stole more than Harrison Caldwell's voice. She stole the fiction of inevitability that slavery depended on, stole the narrative that enslaved people were passive victims rather than active resistors, stole the assumption that power always flows from those who shout loudest. She replaced those stolen fictions with something more valuable and more lasting. A story of a woman who chose freedom over safety, movement over compliance, silence over subjugation. That story, passed down through generations, preserved in family histories and historical records, continues to speak long after all the voices from that winter night in 1860 have fallen silent. The years Clara spent building her life in Canada were filled with challenges that tested her in ways different from but no less demanding than slavery itself. Freedom, she discovered, was not simply the absence of chains, but the presence of responsibility, the weight of making choices that affected not just her survival, but her identity. In the settlement near Windsor, she encountered other former slaves who carried their own traumas, their own stories of escape and loss. Some had left children behind, unable to bring them north. Others had watched family members die during failed escape attempts. The community was bound together by shared pain and shared determination to build something better. Clara's first winter in Canada was brutal in ways she hadn't anticipated. The cold was more intense than Kentucky winters, and the small wooden house she shared with 3 other women offered minimal insulation against the wind that howled off the Detroit River. They heated the space with a single wood stove, taking turns staying awake through the night to keep the fire burning, rationing fuel carefully because money was scarce and work was hard to find. Clara took whatever employment she could get, washing laundry for white families, cleaning houses, occasionally helping in the bakery owned by the Virginia man who had given her that first job. The work itself was familiar, the same domestic tasks she had performed on the Caldwell plantation, but the context transformed everything. When she washed clothes now, she was paid actual money that she could spend or save as she chose. When she cleaned houses, she could leave at the end of the day and return to her own space. Modest as it was, the difference between working as a slave and working as a free woman seemed subtle from the outside, but felt revolutionary from within. Clara found herself stopping sometimes in the middle of tasks, overwhelmed by the simple realization that she was choosing this labor, that she could walk away if she wanted, that her time belonged to her. But freedom also brought isolation. In slavery, despite the horror, there had been community enforced by proximity and shared suffering. The slave quarters on the Caldwell plantation had been cramped and inadequate, but they had been filled with people Clara had known her entire life. She had grown up with some of them, had watched children be born, had mourned the dead alongside others who understood the specific grief of losing someone to slavery's violence. In Canada, that automatic community didn't exist. The settlement included people from different plantations, different states, even different countries. They shared the experience of slavery and escape, but the specific details, the particular traumas and memories that defined individual lives, these remained private and often incommunicable. Clara struggled with nightmares during her first years of freedom. She would wake gasping, convinced she was back in the Caldwell kitchen, with Harrison's voice shaking the walls. Other times she dreamed about the journey north, about being caught and dragged back to Kentucky in chains, about punishments worse than anything she had actually experienced. The dreams were so vivid, that sometimes she needed several minutes after waking to convince herself they weren't real, that she truly was in Canada, that Harrison Caldwell could no longer reach her. She attended church services at a small Baptist congregation that met in a building that had once been a barn. The preacher, a man named Reverend Washington who had escaped from Georgia 10 years earlier, delivered sermons that acknowledged the specific spiritual challenges facing former slaves trying to build new lives. He spoke about the Exodus story, about the Israelites wandering in the wilderness after leaving Egypt, struggling with freedom after generations of bondage. Clara found comfort in those sermons, in the recognition that her difficulties adjusting to freedom were shared by others, that confusion and fear and occasional longing for the terrible certainty of slavery were normal responses to extraordinary transition. It was at church that Clara met Robert Freeman. He was a carpenter, skilled at his trade, who had purchased his freedom from a Maryland owner in 1855 after spending 15 years saving money from work he did on Sundays and holidays. Robert was quiet where Clara was observant, steady where she was still learning to trust stability. He had built a small house on the edge of the settlement, had established himself as a reliable craftsman whose work was sought by both black and white clients in the area. He was 34 when they met, 6 years older than Clara, and he carried himself with a confidence that came from having bought his own freedom rather than stolen it. Their courtship was slow and careful. Both had been damaged by slavery in ways that made trust difficult. Robert had lost a wife and child when they were sold away from him before he secured his freedom, a wound that still ached despite the years that had passed. Clara carried her own losses, her mother's death, the violence she had witnessed, the complicated guilt about Harrison Caldwell's injury. They shared fragments of their histories gradually, like people trading precious stones, testing to see if the other would handle them gently. They married in 1862, during the second year of the Civil War, in a ceremony at the church with most of the settlement in attendance. Clara wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric, purchased with money she had saved over 2 years, the first new clothing she had ever owned that wasn't handed down or made from scraps. Robert had built an addition onto his house, creating space for a family he hoped they would build together. The wedding was simple but joyful, marked by singing and shared food and the profound satisfaction of two people choosing each other freely, without any master's permission required or acknowledged. Their first child, a daughter they named Grace, was born in 1863 on a summer morning so beautiful it seemed like a gift from the universe itself. Clara held the baby and wept, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't articulate. This child was born free, would never know the fear Clara had lived with every day of her first 28 years. Grace would grow up in a house her father owned, would attend school, would make choices about her own life. The magnitude of that difference between Clara's childhood and Grace's seemed almost miraculous. But motherhood also brought new fears. Clara found herself constantly worried about Grace's safety, about illness or accident, or the possibility that somehow slavery would reach across the border and claim her daughter, despite all laws and logic saying otherwise. She watched Grace with an intensity that sometimes bordered on obsession, counting the baby's breaths while she slept, checking for fever multiple times a day, reacting to every cry as if it signaled catastrophe. Robert, patient and understanding, helped her recognize that these fears, while natural, couldn't be allowed to control their lives. Grace needed room to grow, to explore, to take the small risks that learning required. Clara gradually relaxed into motherhood, discovering capacities for joy and playfulness she hadn't known she possessed. She sang to Grace, songs she remembered her own mother singing, melodies that carried history and continuity across generations. She told stories, inventing characters and adventures that made Grace laugh and clap her small hands. She taught Grace to walk, to talk, to navigate the world with confidence, and in teaching her daughter these things, Clara found herself learning them too, discovering who she could be when not defined by slavery's constraints. A second child, a son named Frederick, after Frederick Douglass, whose writings Robert read aloud in the evenings, was born in 1865, the same year the Civil War ended and slavery was officially abolished throughout the United States. The timing seemed symbolic, as if Frederick's arrival marked a new chapter in history. Clara allowed herself to hope, carefully and tentatively, that maybe the world was truly changing, that maybe her children would grow up in a reality fundamentally different from the one she had endured. Life in the settlement developed its own rhythms and traditions. The community organized events to celebrate important occasions, marking Emancipation Day on January 1st with gatherings that included speeches and music and shared meals. They established a school, crude at first, meeting in various houses until they could construct a dedicated building. The teacher was a young woman from Boston, white but committed to the cause of educating former slaves and their children. Clara insisted that both Grace and Frederick attend as soon as they were old enough, understanding that education represented power that no one could take away. Clara herself attended evening literacy classes, finally learning to read and write with a proficiency beyond the bare basics she had picked up in slavery. The process was difficult, her mind trained by decades of survival rather than academic learning, but she persisted. She wanted to read books to her children, wanted to write letters, wanted to access the knowledge that had been deliberately withheld from her. By her mid-30s, Clara could read well enough to work through newspapers and simple books, an achievement that filled her with pride, perhaps disproportionate to the skill itself, but absolutely appropriate to what it represented. The settlement's economy was precarious, dependent on work that white employers were willing to give black workers, which was never as much or as fairly compensated as the work deserved. Robert's carpentry business provided steady income because his skills were undeniable, and he had built a reputation for reliability. Clara's seamstress work also brought money into the household. Though the amounts were small and irregular, they saved carefully, lived simply, invested what they could in their children's futures. The house Robert had built expanded gradually over the years as the family grew and finances allowed. Each addition representing security slowly accumulated. News from the United States filtered into the Canadian settlement through newspapers, letters, and the accounts of newly arrived refugees. The Civil War's progress was followed with intense interest and considerable anxiety. Would the Union actually win? Would slavery truly be abolished? And if so, what would that mean for the millions of former slaves suddenly freed into a society that had never prepared for their inclusion? The questions were enormous, and the answers remained uncertain, even as Union victories accumulated and Confederate territory shrank. Clara received occasional news about Jefferson County and the Caldwell plantation through indirect channels. A woman who arrived in the settlement in 1864 had been enslaved on a neighboring property and knew about the Caldwell family's decline. She told Clara that Harrison Caldwell had become a recluse after losing his voice, rarely leaving the house, communicating through written notes and his wife's voice. The plantation had been sold to pay debts, the slaves scattered to other owners before Lincoln's proclamation freed them. Margaret Caldwell had died in 1863 of typhoid fever, and Harrison had moved to Louisville to live with his eldest son, a man who had joined the Confederate Army and returned home after being wounded at the Battle of Shiloh. Clara listened to this information with carefully controlled emotions. She felt no satisfaction at Harrison's continued suffering, but neither did she feel guilt or regret. He had made choices throughout his life, had built his identity on cruelty and domination, and was now experiencing consequences. That seemed like justice of a sort, imperfect and incomplete, but better than nothing. She asked the woman if there was any ongoing search for her, any active attempts to bring her back to Kentucky, now that the Fugitive Slave Act was essentially meaningless with the Confederacy collapsing. The woman assured her that no one was looking, that Clara had been forgotten in the chaos of war and social transformation. The end of the Civil War in April 1865 brought celebrations to the settlement that lasted for days. People who had escaped decades earlier, who had given up hope of ever seeing slavery ended legally, wept openly at the news. The 13th Amendment's ratification later that year made it official, transformed the United States Constitution to explicitly prohibit slavery and involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime. The legal framework that had defined millions of people as property was dismantled, replaced with a promise of freedom that, while complicated by countless remaining obstacles, represented genuine historical transformation. But Clara, like many former slaves, approached this victory with mixed feelings. Joy, certainly, at knowing that no one else would be born into the condition she had endured. Relief that her children would never need to fear being enslaved, but also anger at how long it had taken, how many lives had been destroyed, how much suffering had been inflicted before the nation finally recognized the fundamental humanity of black people. And underneath these emotions, a deeper uncertainty about what came next. Freedom was the beginning, not the end. The hard work of building genuine equality, of transforming legal status into lived reality, still lay ahead. Some people in the settlement debated returning to the United States now that slavery was abolished. Land was supposedly available to former slaves in the South. Opportunities existed in cities that needed labor for reconstruction and industrial expansion. The United States represented home for many. Despite everything, the place where their families and histories were rooted. But others, including Clara and Robert, chose to remain in Canada. They had built lives here, had established themselves, owned property, had children growing up as Canadian citizens. The promise of American freedom seemed fragile, subject to reversal by the same white population that had defended slavery so fiercely. Better to stay where freedom was secure, where legal status wasn't subject to the shifting political winds of a nation still deeply divided about racial equality. Clara's relationship with her past remained complicated throughout her adult life. She had escaped physically, had built a new existence, but the memories of slavery never fully released their grip on her consciousness. Certain sounds, a door slamming, someone shouting, would trigger immediate visceral reactions. her body responding to remembered danger before her mind could process that the threat was gone. The smell of tobacco made her nauseated, bringing back memories of the Caldwell plantation's primary crop and the labor involved in its cultivation. She avoided whiskey, couldn't tolerate its presence even in cooking, because the smell reminded her of Harrison Caldwell's breath, his voice amplified by alcohol, his violence emboldened by drunkenness. She shared some of these struggles with Robert, who understood because he carried his own scars, but other aspects of her past, particularly the night she left Kentucky, remained largely private. She told Robert that there had been an incident, that Harrison Caldwell had been injured, and she had taken the opportunity to escape during the confusion. She didn't mention her role, however unintentional, in that injury. She didn't describe the moment when she held the silver whistle and blew those signals that had terrorized slaves for decades. Some truths seemed too complex to share, too weighted with moral ambiguity to articulate without fearing judgment or misunderstanding. As Grace and Frederick grew older, Clara began teaching them about their heritage more deliberately. She told them stories about their grandmother, about the conditions on plantations, about the courage required simply to survive day after day. She wanted them to understand where they came from, what had been endured, so they could live free. But she also wanted to protect them from the full weight of slavery's horror, to let them be children without carrying burdens that weren't theirs to bear. Finding the balance between education and protection proved challenging, a line Clara continually adjusted based on her children's ages and emotional capacities. The settlement evolved over the years, becoming more established and less precarious as members accumulated resources and connections. A second church was founded to accommodate different denominational preferences. Small businesses opened, Black-owned shops that served both the settlement and surrounding white communities. A newspaper began publication, printed on a donated press, focusing on news relevant to the Black Canadian population. Clara occasionally contributed articles, short pieces about practical matters like preserving food or managing household budgets, writing that helped her develop confidence in her literacy and her voice. Political debates within the settlement often centered on questions about identity and loyalty. Were they Canadian now, or American, in exile? Should they focus on building institutions within the settlement, or integrating more fully into the broader Canadian society? How should they relate to the ongoing struggles of Black Americans, who were technically free after 1865 but facing new forms of oppression through black codes and terrorist violence from organizations like the Ku Klux Klan? These questions had no easy answers, and different people within the community held passionate, conflicting opinions. Clara generally avoided political debates, preferring to focus on practical matters of daily survival and family well-being. But she felt strongly about education, believing it was the most important investment the community could make in its future. She served on the committee that managed the settlement school, advocated for hiring additional teachers, fundraised for books and supplies. She wanted Grace and Frederick to have opportunities she had been denied, to develop their minds fully, to prepare for lives that weren't limited by others' expectations about what Black people could achieve. By 1870, Clara was 42 years old, the mother of 4 children, Grace, Frederick, and 2 younger daughters named Harriet and Josephine. Robert's carpentry business had expanded to include 2 apprentices, young men from the settlement who were learning the trade. The house had grown to accommodate the larger family, now featuring 6 rooms, including a separate bedroom for Clara and Robert, a luxury that still felt almost decadent. They had a vegetable garden, chickens for eggs, a cow for milk. The material conditions of their lives, while modest by white middle-class standards, represented wealth and security beyond anything Clara had imagined possible during her years in slavery. She sometimes found herself thinking about the Caldwell plantation, wondering what had become of the land, whether the buildings still stood, if anyone remembered the people who had lived and worked and suffered there. She heard through various channels that much of Kentucky's plantation economy had collapsed after the war, that former slaves had scattered throughout the region and beyond, that the social order that had seemed so permanent and inevitable had dissolved remarkably quickly once its legal foundations were removed. The news gave her satisfaction mixed with sadness for all the wasted years, all the destroyed lives, all the history that could never be recovered or repaired. Letters arrived occasionally from people Clara had known in slavery, former Caldwell slaves who had tracked her down through the network of connections that linked black communities across North America. These letters brought news of deaths and marriages and children born free, updates on struggles and successes, requests for advice or assistance, or simply connection with someone who shared specific memories. Clara treasured these letters, kept them in a wooden box Robert had made for her, took them out sometimes to reread and remember the people who had shared her youth. One letter, arriving in 1873, brought news that Harrison Caldwell had died. The letter was from a woman named Ruth, who had worked in the Caldwell kitchen alongside Clara, who had been sold to another owner in 1861 and eventually freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. Ruth had remained in Jefferson County, married a man who worked as a blacksmith, was raising 3 children in a small house they rented but hoped to buy. She wrote that Harrison had died alone in Louisville, his son having moved west to Colorado to escape debts and memories. There had been a small funeral attended mostly by people who had known Harrison's father and felt obligated to pay respects to the family name rather than the man himself. Clara read Ruth's letter several times, trying to understand her own reaction to this news. Harrison Caldwell had defined so much of her early life, had been the embodiment of everything she had needed to escape. His death should have felt significant, perhaps even liberating, but she felt mainly emptiness, a recognition that his life had ultimately been wasted, spent accumulating power and wealth that had dissolved like snow in spring, leaving nothing of value behind. He had had opportunities to be different, to use his inherited advantages to build something worth preserving, but he had chosen cruelty instead, had built an identity on domination that collapsed when his voice, the instrument of that domination, was taken from him. She wrote back to Ruth, a long letter that took several evenings to compose, sharing news about her life in Canada, her family, her work. She asked about others from the Caldwell plantation, what had become of people they had known. She enclosed a small amount of money, $5, knowing it would help Ruth's family even though it represented sacrifice on Clara's part. The act of correspondence, of maintaining connections across distance and time, felt important somehow, a way of honoring shared history without being trapped by it. Grace, now 20 years old, had become a teacher herself, working in the settlement school that Clara had helped establish. She was engaged to marry a young man named Benjamin Larson, whose parents had escaped from North Carolina in the 1850s. The wedding was planned for the following summer, and Clara found herself experiencing the complex emotions of any mother watching a child transition into independent adulthood. Pride at Grace's accomplishments, anxiety about her future, hope that she would find happiness, and underneath it all, profound gratitude that Grace's life was nothing like Clara's had been at the same age. Frederick, at 18, was apprenticing with his father, learning carpentry and showing aptitude for the craft that exceeded even Robert's expectations. The younger daughters, Harriet and Josephine, were 12 and 10, both attending school and showing promise in their studies. Clara looked at her children and saw the future she had fought for, the reason everything else, the escape, the dangerous journey north, the years of struggle to establish herself in Canada, had been worthwhile. The settlement's population fluctuated over the years, as some families returned to the United States, while others arrived seeking refuge from new forms of oppression developing in the post-war South. Clara heard stories from these newcomers about conditions in states like Mississippi and Louisiana, about sharecropping systems that trapped former slaves in debt, about violence from white supremacist groups that went unpunished by authorities, about voting rights promised and then stolen through literacy tests and poll taxes and outright intimidation. The reports made Clara grateful she had stayed in Canada, that she had built her life in a place where, while racism certainly existed, the legal and social structures at least formally recognized her humanity and rights. She became something of an elder in the settlement community, a woman people came to for advice about practical matters and also for perspective on history. Younger people, those born in freedom, sometimes struggled to understand the experiences of those who had lived through slavery. Clara found herself in the position of teacher and witness, explaining what it had been like, helping new generations understand the history that had shaped their parents and grandparents. She tried to be honest without being overwhelming, to convey both the horror and the resilience, to make clear that enslaved people had been victims of systematic oppression but also agents of their own survival and resistance. One particular conversation stayed with Clara for years afterward. A young woman in her early 20s, born free in the settlement, had asked Clara why she didn't hate white people more visibly, why she could interact with white customers and neighbors without apparent rage. Clara had considered the question carefully before answering, recognizing its legitimacy and its complexity. "I spent too many years hating," Clara had said finally. Hating Harrison Caldwell, hating the system that made men like him possible, hating myself sometimes for not fighting back harder or escaping sooner. That hate ate at me from the inside, made me sick in ways that had nothing to do with my body. When I got to Canada, when I started building this life, I decided I couldn't carry that hate anymore. It was too heavy, took up too much space I needed for other things. So I put it down, not because white people deserve my forgiveness, not because what happened was acceptable, but because I deserve peace, carrying hate for people who don't even think about me anymore, who don't care about the damage they did. That's just slavery by another name. I won't let them keep stealing my life, even after I escaped." The young woman had nodded slowly, processing this perspective. Clara didn't know if her answer was right, didn't claim it was the only valid response to slavery's legacy, but it was her truth, the understanding she had reached through years of processing trauma and building a life beyond it. As Clara entered her 50s, Her health began showing the accumulated effects of hard labor and inadequate nutrition during her early decades. Her hands developed arthritis that made detailed sewing work increasingly difficult. Her back, strained by years of carrying heavy loads, ached in cold weather. She tired more easily, found that tasks that had once been simple now required rest periods and careful pacing. Robert, still strong at 60, took over more of the household's physical labor, showing in actions the devotion he sometimes struggled to express in words. But Clara's mind remained sharp, and her commitment to community service only deepened as physical capacity declined. She worked with the church's benevolent society, helping new arrivals to the settlement get established, connecting them with housing and employment opportunities, sharing practical wisdom about navigating life in Canada. She served as an informal midwife, attending births and providing care based on knowledge accumulated through her own pregnancies and years of helping other women in the community. She maintained correspondence with people scattered across North America, creating a network of connection and information that helped families separated by slavery and war stay in touch. The story of her escape from Kentucky and the mysterious circumstances of Harrison Caldwell's voice being stolen continued to circulate and evolve in the settlement and beyond. Clara rarely spoke about it directly, which only added to the legend's power. Some versions portrayed her as having used African magic passed down from her mother. Others claimed she had poisoned Harrison with herbs she cultivated secretly. A few came closer to the truth, describing an accident in the study and Clara's quick decision to escape during the confusion. But the details mattered less than what the story represented. Proof that even the most powerful masters were vulnerable, that enslaved people could and did resist, that courage and intelligence could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Clara's granddaughter, Grace's daughter Elizabeth, was born in 1877 and became particularly close to Clara during the girl's childhood. Elizabeth would visit her grandmother's house, sitting in the kitchen while Clara worked, listening to stories about the old days. Clara found that she could talk more freely with Elizabeth than she had with her own children, perhaps because another generation's distance made the history feel safer to discuss honestly. It was to Elizabeth, when the girl was 14, that Clara finally told the complete story of the night she left Kentucky. They were sitting on the porch during a summer evening, watching fireflies drift across the yard, and Elizabeth had asked about the famous escape, wanting to know the real truth rather than the legends. Clara looked at her granddaughter, saw intelligence and maturity in the girl's face, and decided it was time for the full story to be shared with at least one person. She described everything: the winter storm, Harrison's rage, the accident in the study, the moment his voice disappeared, the decision to take the whistle and walk away. She described the journey north, the fear and cold and desperate determination. She described arriving in Canada, building this life, the complicated mixture of guilt and satisfaction she felt about Harrison's condition. She held nothing back, trusting Elizabeth to handle the truth. Elizabeth listened without interrupting, her young face serious and thoughtful. When Clara finished, the girl asked the question that mattered most: whether Clara had meant to hurt Harrison. Clara gave the same answer she had given herself 1,000 times over the years. I meant to survive. What happened to him was his own doing, his own rage catching up with him. I was just there when it happened, but I chose to walk away. That choice was mine, and it's what mattered most." Elizabeth nodded, understanding in her eyes. She reached out and took Clara's hand, holding it gently, and they sat together in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the yard. Clara felt relief at having shared the complete story, at knowing that at least one person understood the full truth and didn't judge her for it. The years passed with increasing speed, as years tend to do in later life. Clara watched her children establish their own households, watched grandchildren be born and grow. Grace's family expanded to include 4 children. Frederick married and had 3. Harriet and Josephine, both married men from the settlement, started their own families. The house Clara and Robert had built became the center of an expanding network of descendants, a place where Sunday dinners brought together 3 generations, where holidays were celebrated with noise and laughter and abundant food. Clara's health continued its gradual decline through her 60s. The arthritis worsened, making winters increasingly difficult. She developed a persistent cough that no remedy seemed to cure entirely. Her eyesight dimmed, making reading and sewing nearly impossible without strong light and considerable effort. But she remained mentally alert, still sharp with observations and advice, still the matriarch around whom the family organized itself. In 1890, at age 58, Clara attended a celebration marking the 25th anniversary of slavery's abolition in the United States. The event was held in Windsor, attracting former slaves and their descendants from throughout Ontario. Speeches were given about progress and continued struggles, about the work that remained to achieve genuine equality. Musical performances honored the spirituals that had sustained people through bondage. A shared meal brought together hundreds of people, representing dozens of different plantations and states, united by common history and common hopes. Clara attended with her entire family, children and grandchildren, and even one great-grandchild, Grace's oldest daughter, Elizabeth's first baby. She looked at this gathering of descendants, this entire branch of humanity that existed only because she had chosen to walk away from the Caldwell plantation that winter night 3 decades earlier, and felt overwhelming gratitude. Every breath these children took was a victory over slavery. Every achievement they accomplished was a rejection of the system that had claimed people like Clara were incapable of autonomy or excellence. During the event, Clara was asked to speak, to share her story with the assembled crowd. She almost declined, feeling unqualified and uncomfortable with public attention. But Robert encouraged her, and Grace insisted, and finally Clara agreed. She stood on a small platform, looking out at hundreds of faces, and spoke from her heart rather than from any prepared text. She talked about slavery, about Harrison Caldwell and his voice, about the system of domination that voice represented. She talked about the night she left, carefully editing details but conveying the essential truth of choosing freedom over continued bondage. She talked about the journey north, about the people who helped her, about building a life in Canada. And she talked about the importance of remembering, of making sure future generations understood what had been endured and what had been achieved, so that the price paid for freedom would never be forgotten or taken for granted. When Clara finished speaking, the crowd stood and applauded, and she saw tears on many faces, saw recognition, and shared understanding. She stepped down from the platform feeling exhausted but satisfied. feeling that perhaps her story, her witness, had value beyond her own family, that it contributed something to the larger historical record. Clara James Freeman died in her sleep on a cold March morning in 1893, with Robert beside her and children and grandchildren arriving throughout the day to say goodbye. She was 61 years old, had lived 33 years in freedom after spending her first 28 years enslaved. The funeral was attended by over 200 people from the settlement and surrounding areas, testament to the respect and affection she had earned through decades of service and quiet dignity. She was buried in the settlement cemetery, under a stone that Robert had carved himself with meticulous care. The inscription was simple but complete. Clara James Freeman, born 1832 Kentucky, died 1893 Canada, lived free. Those last two words captured everything that mattered most to Clara, the choice she had made and the life she had built from that choice. Her story did not end with her death. Elizabeth, the granddaughter to whom Clara had told the complete truth, became the keeper of that history. Elizabeth wrote it down, creating a narrative that she shared with her own children and eventually published in a small volume printed by a Black-owned press in Toronto. The book, titled simply Clara's Journey, circulated through Black communities in Canada and the United States, adding Clara's voice to the growing body of slave narratives that were reshaping how Americans understood their history. The silver whistle that Clara had blown that February night in 1860 remained lost for decades before surfacing in a Louisville antique shop. Its history was unknown to the dealers who sold it, to the collectors who purchased it, to the museum that eventually acquired it, but the object itself survived, a silent witness to events that transformed lives and challenged systems. A small metal instrument that had once organized suffering but had ultimately been turned against that purpose, even if only briefly. Clara of Kentucky, slave woman who stole the master's voice, who walked away through a winter storm, who survived to die free, remains a testament to the enduring human capacity for resistance and reinvention. Her story reminds us that power, no matter how loudly it proclaims itself, is always more fragile than it appears, always vulnerable to those brave enough to challenge it, always subject to the simple but revolutionary act of walking away. In choosing freedom, Clara chose life. In choosing silence over subjugation, she found her own voice. And in walking away into that snow-filled February darkness, she walked toward a future that, while difficult and uncertain, belonged entirely to her. That is the real theft Clara James committed, not of a voice or a whistle, but of her own destiny, claimed from those who believed they owned it. And that theft, unlike any other, was completely justified. The legacy of that theft lives on in every descendant who carries Clara's blood and Clara's courage, in every person who hears her story and finds inspiration to resist their own forms of oppression, in the historical record that finally, belatedly, recognizes the heroism of ordinary people who did extraordinary things simply by insisting on their own humanity. Clara's voice, silent for so many years under slavery's weight, speaks now across time and distance, telling us that freedom is always worth fighting for, that courage can come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through violence, but through the quiet, determined act of walking away from everything designed to keep you in chains.